I want to ask you a question, Ref. Have you heard of anybody named Michael Rotundo?
No.
Michael Rotundo is a 30-year-old who refuses to move out of his parents' house.
I heard the story. I didn't know his name.
We actually had a court hearing, a trial in upstate New York, Tuesday of this week, basically arguing that Rotundo said that he understands his parents can, quote-unquote, evict him from their home, but they've got to give him a 6-month notice. So some eviction laws in upstate New York or in the state of New York apply here, and you can't just, knock on a guy's door and say, hey, you hadn't paid rent last month, you got to get out. There's a process of which you have to go through in New York. Well, State Supreme Court Justice Donald Greenwood basically praised Rotundo for all of his legal research because he had gone through court cases and hearings and passing laws and documentation, and he was arguing that as a family member, he was entitled to 6 months' notice before being evicted. His mother and father actually sued this kid. He's 30 years old. He's not a kid anymore. After their son ignored being asked to leave their home following sending eviction letters. So they actually sent a letter to their son who lived in the home. They offered him money. One of the eviction letters said, Michael, here's $1,100 from us to you to help find a place to stay. There are jobs available, even for those with a poor work history like yours. Get one. You have to work. You can't stay here any longer. He put up a tough fight. He refused to speak directly to his parents in court. He relied only on his legal argument. So a 30-year-old living in his mother and father's home was asked to leave by the mother and father. He refused to leave. Not only did he refuse to leave, it led to a court hearing, a trial in which he did enough legal work to find out there's some, I guess, exemption or loophole in the law that as a family member, you've got to give him 6 months notice. What is the world coming to? I mean, when we get to a place where, kids, 30 years old at the kid, I mean, that's a grown man. I was married with 2 kids at 30. I was married with 2 kids at 26 or 7 years old. But it led me down the road of something you and I have talked about several times on this show. The decline in marriage, the decline in fertility, the decline in people having children. And there are a lot of competing theories in regards to this. I read something yesterday. I believe one of the largest joys of life is to have kids at an age where you can have a youthful experience with your kids. You're young enough to play ball or play catch or, you know what I mean, ride the merry-go-round or the Ferris wheel, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of experiences out there that we can do together. I mean, when I had I think I was 23 when I got married. I was 20. Country boys get married early. You know how that is. Mm. And then, and then we had kids. I think one of my kids, I was married in 87, kid born in 90, kid born in 92. So 5 years into our marriage, I was 30, I'm 27 or 8, probably 28 years old with 2 kids. Well, I was young enough to do things with my kids. Now, young people are waiting till about the age of 30 years old to get married. So there's been a 6-year, and it's getting more and more. I mean, it's really getting accelerated. There are a lot of reports that believe by the year 2025, which is 7 years from now, the average American male will not get married until the age of 33. Females at about 29 or 30. So we're waiting longer to get married. And this person's putting together an argument, and it's kind of an interesting argument. He talks about playing basketball with his father. His dad and 2 of his friends would play, the son and 2 of their friends. And he's talking about, childhood. It meant hope. It meant joy. There was a pleasure that went along with having a kid. And he's arguing that society, for whatever reason, is less hopeful and less joyous. He actually went through some interesting statistics, Reb. The National Center for Health Statistics reported that America's general fertility rate has hit a record low. Never before in our country's history in proportion. Now, obviously, when there's 10 million people in the country and you have so many babies, that's different than 325 million people in the country. But it hit an all-time record low last year. They believe this year will exceed last year's record. And it's kind of raising eyebrows because the majority of these declines in the number of people having children is when the economy is distressed. And when the economy begins to pick up energy and steam and momentum, people begin to feel better about themselves, and they get back to business as the economy rebounds. Well, that's not happening this time. The economy is beginning to rebound. Unemployment's going down. Productivity's going up, except in the, well, I'll leave that. I'll tactfully skirt that without comment. But he's arguing, Rev, that there's something fundamental happening with America's young people. I'm arguing that. I've tried to argue that in a not so articulate way for the past 6 months or so. But he's saying that declining American birth rates, declining marriage rates, declining interest in sex, more and more young people have less and less interest in sex. He wrote a very thoughtful essay. I can't think of the gentleman's name. He's from the University of Virginia, and he's a social scientist. He studies trends and, macros as to what makes a generation do this or a generation do that. And Rev, he talks a lot about the confusion in the aftermath of this Me Too movement. One thing that he attributes a lot of the concern to, and we always wonder, are we too involved in our electronic devices? Do we listen and talk on our phone far more? He believes that this, what he calls a smartphone culture, is making relationships increasingly virtual. They're not personal anymore. They're far more virtual than they were before. Now, he believes that there's an issue with mental health and the young people, the number of young people who are on some sort of prescription medication. He believes influences their being not so interested in sex and reproduction and marriage and all these other things. But he really attributes a lot of his concern, and he believes it's a big deal, as I do. I've got a buddy of mine who believes very little what I do. We disagree on nearly every fundamental point in American politics, culture, and society. But the other day when we were talking about the decline of marriage, he texted me, and he said, "You're on to something." And he called me after the show, and he said, that makes sense. This decline in marriage that you're talking about. Well, there's no question that we're seeing a huge decline in marriage. And I read this article about the 30-year-old who believes it's okay to live with his mom and dad. The failure to launch, young boys, young men who are unwilling to take that step. Basically the parents not shoving them out of the nest, and they're unwilling to take that next step. And you wonder why that's the case, because when I was young, in my generation, that was something you looked forward to. That was the most hopeful moment in your life, when you owned your own place or you rented your own place and you had that liberty and freedom. Independence and responsibility comes along with that.
Sure.
And he's arguing that right now we're living in a generational flux. And it's real, he thinks, ultimately detrimental to society, as I do. Now he blames a lot of this on the smartphone, the ability for us to kind of participate in the world and not be a part of the world. It's non-social. We can sit in our basements or our mom's basement, in case of this gentleman, and we can kind of live out some semblance of a normal life, never leaving home. I'm not arguing never leaving home, but not leaving home as much as others have. And he believes that the lack of relationship, the lack of interaction creates some mental health disorders. And he says we're beginning to see the treating, and he calls it the youthful mental health crisis. And he's saying that a lot of the mental health issues that he deals with, that he does research on, are created and generated by the young person's non-willingness to be as social as they need to be. And I'm not saying this gentleman knows everything he's talking about. He's a credible person. He's had some articles written in the Washington Post. He's been a source for the New York Times. He's someone who is taken very seriously in these sorts of dynamics. And he believes that the smartphone culture allows for young people to be incredibly isolated. And out of that isolation comes an unhealthiness. And out of that unhealthiness comes a lot of mental despair, mental anxiety, We begin to treat them for things that we believe are sicknesses and diseases and things like that, when in essence it is because, for whatever reason, kids are not as responsible as the previous generation or the previous generation to that. He's arguing a bit as I am that he thinks we're at a tipping point, that there is absolute detriment to be done or danger to be done to society if indeed we don't get our arms around this incredibly unsocial, non-communal part of society. And it's by and large young people. I mean, when you look at the statistics and the data, I mean, we're on our computer, you're on yours, I'm on mine probably more than I need to be, but I am aware of my need to interact with other human beings. And I told the story about Saturday night, my wife and I went out to dinner, kind of spur of the moment thing. We were watching television, and I don't know, just, the kids were gone, my boys were gone, and my daughter had something to do. Let's go get something to eat. Went out to a local restaurant. We're sitting there. A family walks in, 2 smartphones and 2 iPads, the iPad minis or whatever they're called. And before they ever, the waiter walked up to the table, kind of take your drink order, and they never said, I'll take a Pepsi or I'll take a Diet Pepsi. They said, what is the Wi-Fi number? And the parents were a little bit standoffish because they didn't want to be the ones to ask what the Wi-Fi password was. But the kids were like, we're not worried about drinks. We're not worried about food. What is the Wi-Fi? I mean, give me I've got to get on this computer. If not, I'll have some sort of spasm. And when I watched, I mean, the parents, because I'm always looking around, the parents were like, I want to hear what he's got to say. I just want to make sure I get the Wi-Fi number as well.
And to your point, that has to have some sort of long-term effect on society.
Without question. But, Rev, we don't know. We have no idea, I think. And look, I'm not qualified. I'm not educated in any way, shape, or form. I can hear some real serious people out there. Well, they probably already left the show. But if there were some serious people out there listening to the show, I could hear some of those people going, well, who the world is this guy to talk about, psychology and sociology and, a psychoanalyst? He's not qualified, and I'm not. I'm not professing to be qualified. I'm a guy who looks around and sees a lot. And don't take this the wrong way. A lot of times we end up kind of where I said we were going to end up. And I just believe sincerely that when we silo ourselves into these self-absorbed existences, there is a price to pay for society at one point in time. And this gentleman is arguing that we're already beginning to see it. And the consequences of it are an increase in the treating of mental disorders, anxiety, depression, but because we're not communal anymore. We don't interact with one another. And I go back to mine and your generation. You're on the computer too much. Mm-hmm. I'm on the computer too much. Mm-hmm. But I'm aware of my need at human interaction. I'm aware of how important it still is for me to talk to people, for me to visit with people, for me to allow people to visit with me and interact. And it's funky, man. I mean, you see some of these young people at the gym, they've got a headset on. They'll spend 2 hours in the gym and not utter a word to anybody. They'll watch a video on their phone, and it's almost like they're in their own little, and I get that. I mean, that's a very comfortable place to be. That's a very controlling place to be. Who controls that world? You do. You absolutely have full autonomy of what's going on. I just think this generation that is coming, we're going to have problems. And I think the problems will be because of our inability or non-interest in interacting with other human beings.